everyone. I'm Eric Kekula, and this is one in a series of presentations based on my book, The Economics of Planning. Today's presentation focuses on Chapter 6, The Economics of Traffic Congestion. And in today's presentation, what we'll do is show how to represent the dilemma of traffic congestion diagrammatically, using the kind of graphs that we've been working with. And in that context, we'll contrast the equilibrium level of traffic flow with the optimum level. And we'll measure the deadweight loss that arises from this divergence between the equilibrium and the optimum. We'll also note that at the optimum, there is still traffic congestion. And so it raises the somewhat paradoxical notion of optimum level of congestion. Then what we'll do in the main part of today's presentation is compare and contrast three different perspectives on traffic congestion, each one of which has a certain validity, yet are quite distinct and complementary to each other. One is the engineering perspective, or the engineer's perspective, and which is supply-based. Another is the planner's perspective, which is more demand-based, the demand for travel. And the third is the economist's perspective, which is focusing on the market signaling. And so we'll see how to represent each of those perspectives using this diagrammatic exposition that we have here. Within the context, especially of the engineering solution, we'll look at how to think about how and to represent the investment aspect of transportation infrastructure, to think about the cost of the infrastructure and how to measure the return to that. So let's get started. So we begin with this fairly straightforward diagram that is similar to what we have in several of the other chapters that we're examining. And so many of these will be familiar. In particular, the marginal benefit curve, I think, is by now quite familiar to most of us, most of you. And what we're measuring along the horizontal axis here is the flow, the trip volume flow, so trips per unit of time. So we can think about this as a given transportation system, a given network, and think about the economic aspects of this transportation system. And this declining marginal benefit, which is typical to what we see, and it's a kind of like, it's like a demand curve, although not exactly in this context, but this marginal benefit is just that. It indicates the benefit for each additional trip as we move along. And so we're accustomed to seeing declining marginal benefits, and that's what we have here. So you can imagine that some people sort of near the 0 point, who have the highest marginal benefit associated with a trip, they may be on their way to the hospital to deliver a baby, very high priority. Other people may be on their way to a lecture on the economics of transportation planning, also very high priority, perhaps not as high as the person who's on the way to deliver a baby at the hospital, and then on and on and on, with declining marginal benefits as more and more trips are added. So against the benefit of these trips is the cost. So the IC curve here is the individual cost, the cost perceived by the individual of taking a trip. And that cost, as shown here, varies with the volume of trips that are already underway. And I think we're all familiar with that idea that if traffic is really heavy, we might be a little bit more hesitant about taking a trip at this time. We might want to think about juggling our schedule in a way that allows us to take the trip when there's not as much traffic. And so that's the basic idea here, that it's the cost that an individual perceives of taking the trip. And we'll assume here that that cost is perceived accurately. Look out, see what the traffic volumes are, and based on that, we can make a judgment of how much it's going to cost in terms of time. So again, the cost here isn't that you're paying for a trip necessarily in any sense of a purchase or a disbursement of cash or monies, but time and the expense of taking a trip in terms of gasoline, etc. All of that figures in, time being a very important element. So that leaves the marginal social cost. Now, the fact that this is not the same as the individual cost is actually the closest we come to a direct representation of congestion and the cost of congestion. The basic idea is that as more cars get onto the freeway, for example, they're not only incurring the cost that they themselves perceive accurately that they're going to experience, but by getting onto what is already a crowded freeway and slowing it down, they're also adding to the time and therefore the cost of everyone else who's already on. And so what we have is an externality that my getting on the freeway or another cohort of 1,000 cars getting on the freeway, not only are they bearing that direct cost themselves of the cost of taking a trip, they're slowing it down for everybody else. And that's that vertical gap between the marginal social cost and the individual cost is explained by that congestion effect. So that's the basic apparatus. Now let's put it to work. So the first thing we'll do here is to observe that the distinction between the equilibrium and the optimum level of traffic flow. And these are indicated here. The E indicates equilibrium, so the T is the traffic flow. And the traffic flow, the equilibrium traffic flow is going to be at that point where the marginal benefit of an additional trip is perceived by that sort of driver on the margin, right? That not on the margin of the road, but on the margin of the analysis, right? So that that driver is looking at their own marginal benefit and comparing it to the cost that they anticipate they will incur, and they're accurate about this. So that point is at TE, as we see here. It's at that point. Beyond that point, the cost that the individual is going to incur by taking a trip exceeds the benefit that that individual, and hence marginal benefit, marginal from the system as a whole, from the perspective of the system as a whole. So that individual cost now exceeds the marginal benefit that would be gained by this driver, and so they'll pass. They won't take that trip. So that's the equilibrium point. But the optimum point, here indicated by T star, is the point at which marginal social costs begin to exceed marginal benefits. And we know that from previous analyses, that what counts is to try to look for an optimum. We want to get to, it's often at the point where marginal costs are just beginning to exceed marginal benefits. So you don't want to go beyond that, but you want to go right up to the point where marginal benefits are still exceeding marginal costs. And so we're taking, since we're wanting to look at this from a system-wide perspective, we're thinking about the marginal system-wide or social costs associated with this trip taking. And hence, T star is indicated here as the optimum. And at that optimum, T star, we can see that this light blue shaded triangle represents the total net benefits derived from the use of this transportation system. So this is actually the transportation system in use, right? And that's why we're measuring trips per time and dollars per trip. So notice when we're looking at an area like this, an area is going to be represented by dollars per trip times trips per time, and that yields dollars per time. So it's a flow of benefit measured in dollar equivalencies here, a flow of benefits derived from the flow of traffic. And these are net because they are the total benefits net of total costs. And the total costs here are, just as in our other examples, are represented by the area beneath the marginal social cost, system-wide cost curve, marginal social cost curve. And so that's this light orange, light tan shaded area represents total cost. And so in this representation, we have a fairly significant chunk of net benefits, flow of net benefits derived from this. But that's the optimum, but recall that the equilibrium is different. The equilibrium is at TE, E for equilibrium. And that's, we can see as represented here, that there is a dead weight loss at the equilibrium, because that's, as you move from T star to TE, then there are more trips than would be indicated for at the optimum point, and there's actually a loss of net benefit, and that loss of net benefit relative to the optimum is indicated by this triangle here, this triangle of inefficiency, which measures the dead weight loss at that equilibrium TE. So one additional point to make here is that at the optimum T star, notice that there is congestion, that at T star, there is a vertical displacement between the individual perceived cost and the marginal system-wide cost. And as you recall, that vertical distance is really a manifestation of congestion. So one might ask, well, if this is truly an optimum, why is there congestion? Congestion's a bad thing. And no one likes congestion. So if it's optimum, why would we have congestion? And the answer, of course, is that yes, no one likes to have congestion, but what we're getting in return is benefit. And so one has to weigh the cost of congestion effects against the benefits of the trip. And that's exactly what we're doing to derive T star, is looking at the point where the marginal system-wide costs exceed, the marginal benefits exceed that marginal system-wide cost. So that's the basic setup. Now let's think about these three different perspectives on traffic congestion. The first one being the engineer's perspective. Well, from an engineering perspective, and I'm both for the engineer, the planner, and the economist, I'm giving a kind of caricature here just so that we can sort of remember it more easily. I mean, and engineers are capable of thinking as planners and as economists do. Economists are capable of thinking as engineers and as planners do, and planners are capable of thinking as engineers and as economists do. So we're not too overt in trying to separate these perspectives, but they are distinct and they are reasonably aligned with those different disciplines. So I permit myself to go ahead with this caricature with that caveat in mind. So from the engineering perspective, the problem is one of insufficient capacity, right? The reason there's congestion on the freeways is that there aren't enough freeways, there aren't enough lanes, there aren't, the capacity is simply too limited. Well, if that's your perspective on the problem, then the answer is quite clear. Build more capacity, add to more capacity. And indeed, we can see many examples of that around us, of new freeways being built and transportation systems being added, including rail and transit and buses, etc. Let's see what that looks like from the perspective of the diagrams that we've just introduced. So in the case of this so-called engineer solution, which is to build more capacity, the way that manifests itself in terms of this diagram is that it pushes the individual cost as well as the marginal social cost curve down, rotates it down as indicated here. And the reason what that shows is that if you've got more capacity, then the freeway is going to be less crowded. If you've got a 4-lane freeway instead of a 2-lane freeway, traffic is going to flow more readily on it. And so the cost associated with a trip is lower because congestion is one of the things that adds to the cost, certainly the time cost, and perhaps other costs as well of that trip. And so as represented here, well, that's a good thing. It's nice to have that individual cost curve and the corresponding marginal social cost curve getting flatter and flatter. And it's represented, note here, by the area of total net benefit derived from use of the system to be higher. Now, a couple of things to mention about this. One is that some people argue that this shows that building more capacity is futile, that as you build more capacity, there will be more trips. And indeed, it is the case here that compared to the original equilibrium position, the volume of trips is higher, and it stands to reason, right? That if the cost of a trip is lower, then the impediment, the barrier to taking a trip is also lower. So it stands to reason that more people will take that trip. It's not so costly. Let's go. So some argue that that's a reason that we shouldn't build. It only encourages people to take more trips. And while it is true that more trips are likely to be taken if we have more capacity and hence the cost of a trip is reduced, just focusing on the fact that there's more flow is forgetting the fact that there's also more benefit associated with the flow. So that brings me to the second point here, which is to think about this as an investment, because what's not shown here is the cost of actually pushing these curves down, right? We can measure, in the context of this graph, we can measure the area of this added triangle that represents the additional net benefit, total net benefit from use of the system as a result of this increase in capacity and the higher volume of trips and the greater benefit flowing from that. Let's suppose we measure that as being, the volume of that as being $5 billion a year. Well, $5 billion a year is a lot of benefit. Well, what if the cost of building that capacity was, say, $100 billion? And let's suppose, we'll make up a number, that the that the debt on that 100 billion, or the opportunity cost of capital, is 8%. Well, what we have is a 5% rate of return right now, that as we just indicated, if that flow of benefits is $5 billion a year and it costs us 100 billion to get that, then you think about that as a 5% rate of return. If the interest rate is 8%, 5% is not a very good rate of return. If the interest rate is 2%, 5% is a reasonable rate of return. So that's the perspective from which we want to look at this kind of economically. It's the cost of building the additional capacity, and that additional capacity is represented in this graph by the dropping down of the cost curves in terms of the cost of actually utilizing the system. And then we have that flow of benefits, and that flow of benefits is a return to the investment that caused those to drop. So let's move on to the planner's perspective. From the planner's perspective, the problem is the focus is less on the question of capacity of the system and thinking about the fact that why are there so many trips? We get in the car and get onto the freeway and drive from A to B because we're at location A, and we need to be, or we want to be, at location B. And to get from A to B, we take the trip. So it's in that sense that we say that transportation is a derived demand. It's actually derived from this separation of origin and destination. So a planner's perspective on this can be to think about, well, if we could design and manage land uses and the nexus between transportation and land use in such a way that the origins and the destinations did a better job of coinciding, then that would obviate the need for the trips. And so this is, for example, what transit-oriented development looks to do, is to try to design land use patterns around transit hubs in such a way that it becomes convenient to either live nearby. You've got density of residential development and office development, et cetera. And so you can, in principle, live and work and shop and play all within the same area, and you would less frequently be looking to take a trip to go someplace else. And so that's the approach that's taken here. And let's take a look at what that looks like in terms of our diagram. So as indicated, the planner's solution works primarily on the marginal benefit. And the idea is that the marginal benefits associated with trips is lower if you don't need a trip. If I don't need to get in the car and drive off from location A to location B, then the benefit of taking that trip is less than it otherwise would be. And so we get this downward shift of the marginal benefit curve, and that reduces the congestion pressure on this system. All right, so that gives us one more, and that's the economist's approach. And the economist's perspective is one of focusing on the externality, the fact that there is this faulty price signal, that the individual cost differs from the true marginal social cost. And so individuals, when they're making a judgment about should they take a trip or not, are doing it on the basis of the cost that they will experience. And they typically will not be factoring into account the fact that in addition to bearing that cost themselves, they're also, by contributing to the congestion, adding to everyone else's cost. And so if the perspective on the traffic congestion problem is one of a faulty price signal, then the approach is to fix that signal, to intervene with on the price side with a congestion tax. And we can see here what that looks like. The idea is to add a tax that will essentially shift the individual cost curve up so that the individual driver perceives not only the cost that they will incur by taking the trip, not only the cost that they themselves will incur, but also a congestion tax that measures or that at least reflects the cost that is being borne by everyone on the system due to this mounting congestion. And that's what we see with these fast track lanes and other lanes that essentially charge based on the level of congestion flow place. And so again, the economists' thinking is, well, if it's a faulty price signal, let's fix the signal. And if we do that, then as shown here, it will now bring about the result that the equilibrium point will shift over and it will coincide with the optimum. So those are three different perspectives which are not mutually negating. All three of them have can work in conjunction with each other. And so we as planners empower ourselves by being able to incorporate all three of them, those perspectives together. And this simple approach is a nice, easy way to do so. See you at the next one.